Cool. All right, let's get started. Yeah, I'm sure people will eventually trickle in. Today's lecture is actually going to be very short because the focus of today really is on the workshop, which at this point is just going to be, we're starting to work on reviewing a lot of stuff that we've learned, right, and just getting you guys more practice reps with the problems and with the concepts that we've been dealing with. So today's lecture is more of like it's good for you to know kind of how the web works and how JavaScript kind of plays a role in the web. But we're not going to be teaching any kind of fundamental coding concepts here. So a lot of what you see in the workshops should be redundant at this point in terms of you should have seen problems very similar to in the past. Okay, so all of that is to say that today's lecture is going to be very brief, and we're not going to spend kind of too much time going into the details on this slide. They're just more kind of for your context. Okay, so we talked a lot about JavaScript, or actually we've been using JavaScript almost exclusively over the past month at this point. And I mentioned yesterday about how JavaScript is probably the most popular language out there, and part of the reason for its popularity is because it's able to be used on both the front end and the back end, right? And today we'll be focusing mostly on the front end. So what do I mean when I say the front end? Really, it pretty much boils down to your browser, right? So almost all modern browsers of your choice, Opera, Safari, Chrome, IE, they all support JavaScript, right? And what that means is if I give it JavaScript, it will be able to look at it, understand what this JavaScript is saying or doing, and then execute that code. Okay. If I gave your browser Python or Ruby or another language, it will look at it and say, I don't know how to interpret this. I don't know what this is telling me to do, and I'm going to break, or I'm not going to do what you want me to do. Okay. The second bullet here, right, talks about how does a browser actually use JavaScript, or how does it understand what the defined standards of JavaScript are, right? Like how does Chrome know what JavaScript, what reserved keywords are in JavaScript, or how JavaScript methods work? Well, yesterday we talked about ECMA, right? The foundation that sets forth the new ever more kind of robust standards for JavaScript, and so basically ECMA publishes these JavaScript standards that say this is what JavaScript should do, this is how your current implementation of JavaScript should read it, and then it's up to Chrome or Safari or Firefox or any of these companies to go and say, okay, great, here are the rules, now let us create the engine through which we can actually execute and run JavaScript appropriately. So Chrome has something called V8, which is their engine for interpreting JavaScript. Mozilla has SpiderMonkey, and there are a few others as well. But this is one of the reasons why, as if you ever choose to work on the front end, and maybe in a more kind of not serious but in a deeper role, one of the worst things about working as a front end developer is you have to test your code, right, to make sure it runs. But what that means is that you need to test across every single browser, because every single browser reads and interprets JavaScript potentially a little bit differently. So something that works in Safari might not work in Chrome, or vice versa. And in general, a lot of things don't work in IE because it's just really outdated, and in some ways they have a lot of flaws in there too, right? And the worst part about that is, even in my previous company, when we tested in Internet Explorer, in which things didn't work, you can't just test an IE 10, right? It goes back to IE 9, 8, 7, 6, etc. So really, a lot of times, working on the front end, a lot of it is just making sure that because every browser interprets JavaScript and interprets code differently, you need to make sure that your technology is very consistent across every single browser. So in a lot of sites, if you actually open up the DOM and look at the code on the site, they'll have entire common blocks that says only run if you're in IE, or only run if you're in Chrome, or only run if you're in Firefox, right? So they have kind of very specific browser-specific code that's meant to address the fact that we're aware that sometimes browser takes a look at the code and interprets it just a little bit differently than another browser. Normally, when people think about a web page, right, or what a user sees, the first thing that comes to mind usually is HTML, right? And I'm sure all of you have seen it in some capacity, right? This is like the whole carrots and block tags saying this is a header, this is the body, right? This is a footer. We have paragraph tags, we have all these tags, etc., etc. And that's HTML for what's loaded on the page. There also is this tag in JavaScript called the script tag. And basically that just tells this browser that, hey, whatever text I put in between this script tag, you should be interpreting it as if it was JavaScript, right? So normally, if I had an HTML document and if I didn't have these script tags here, I just wrote console.log. My browser's gonna look at this code and think, oh, he just wants to write literally a string called console.log, hello from the console, etc. And that's what's gonna print on my screen, right? But if I put it within the context of the script tag, now what it's telling the browser to do is, hey, everything else is HTML, but everything between these tags evaluated like you would a normal JavaScript statement, right? Executed like this JavaScript code, because everything else outside of the script tag is right now is being executed as if it was HTML. Everything inside of here executed like JavaScript. So when it sees this line, it will actually log hello from the console out to your console. Okay, so just know that that's that usually when you look at the code that mixes to a page, you might see a bunch of HTML. But if you want to see what JavaScript is actually being rendered on the page, just look for the script tag, and everything within that tag will be rendered as JavaScript. The other thing to notice is that when a file reads this, it's going to read it it's going to read it through, and basically it's going to execute the JavaScript as soon as the page loads, right? So one of the tricky things about also writing code on the front end is sometimes some elements may take longer than others to load, right? Like your page may load, but you may say, hey, can you get me this data to show the user, right? And then you only want to maybe do something with that data once you're sure the data has finished loading. So another thing to be aware of, especially when we write JavaScript on the front end, is just being cognizant of what's available on the page and what you're trying to do with it, right? Kind of like how a race condition usually works in JavaScript too, is that if you call a variable before it's defined or before you would give it a value, you're going to get errors. Same thing here, right? If you load up JavaScript that tells it to do something on the page and the page isn't ready yet, you're going to get errors. So as you look at kind of production level front end code, you also notice there's a lot of attention, a lot of details being paid to kind of in what order things are being done. And oftentimes, when a page finishes loading, it actually fire off an event telling the rest of the page, hey, I'm done loading all my content. And usually that's when JavaScript is being run. But usually you'll basically see like an if clause around that, or another clause that essentially tells the page, hey, when you're done loading, do all of this, rather than do it by default upon the initial page load. Okay, so basically what we talked about so far is if I give your Chrome browser a big glob of text, your Chrome is going to recognize that, hey, part of this is HTML and part of it is JavaScript, right? And it's going to run it accordingly. Here we're just going to backtrack a little bit and talk about how the internet actually works, right? And obviously the internet is super complex and extremely hairy, so this is obviously a very, very high-level overview of it. But what the internet really is it's just a network of computers, right? And so who wants to kind of walk me through, if I go into my browser and I go to google.com and I press enter, I type it into the URL bar in Chrome and I hit enter, what's actually happening behind the scenes there? Like, how does the internet actually work beyond just it being like magic?
Searches. Well, you're trying to access Google's.
Right. So literally, yeah. I mean, I can do it for you guys if you want, but I'm sure you guys have all been to Google before, right? Yeah. If I open up a Chrome tab, I type in www.google.com and I hit enter. What happens?
Pulls up Google page.
Okay, it pulls up a Google page. Can you walk me into more detail into how that's happening?
Converts the HTTP to an IP code, an IP address, and then goes to it. Everything has an IP code, which is translated to a text, like Google or whatever. So when you put it converts it, and the screen to.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So basically, what I think we're trying to say is basically when I hit that, it takes the www.google.com address and it says, okay, this is basically an address, right? And this address maps to essentially a computer or a server somewhere. Does anybody know what that's called? That lookup that helps you map something from an actual string name to a IP address. A DNS lookup, exactly. So basically, if I go to google.com, google.com doesn't really mean anything to like most servers, right? Really, what google.com is, if I go to google.com, Chrome does is Chrome sends this request to my DNS saying, hey, this person wants to go to this address. And the DNS will say, great, what's it called? And it'll say, oh, it's called google.com. And DNS will say, oh, actually, that's linked to this server here, right? Which is like, like usually like 2 numbers dot 3 numbers dot 3 numbers dot 2 numbers, right? So the first thing that we do is we actually go through that, and it actually gives us like kind of it actually gives us our local server for that website, right? And what do I mean when I say our local server? Just think of something like Google, right? It's absolutely gigantic, right? Not everything from Google is going to run through one single address. Like it's just not possible, right? That computer would break instantaneously almost, right? So if I'm accessing Google, in New York versus in Europe, right, or some other parts of the world, I'm going to have a different Google address than perhaps you might, right? Because there's going to be different servers going around. And so all that does is the DNS is going to tell us, okay, you want to go to google.com, you should go to this address here. Okay, so the next step what's happening is once we have the addresses, we say, okay, great, let's go there. We now are trying to establish a connection with that address. What's at the end of that address that we go to? Like we go to our DNS, we say, I want to go to google.com. Google says, great, Google's at this address. And we try to establish a connection with that address. What's that address? Like what's actually there? A server, right? It's a computer whose entire job is to say, hey, make requests from me and I'll give you back what you want. That's all it is. Okay. So now we essentially are able to take, so now the first thing we do is we want to establish a connection with that server, right? Saying, okay, great, are you Google? Can I trust you? This is what I want, et cetera, et cetera. So that connection is now established. Okay. What happens next? Well, so when I go to google.com, right? So right now I've established a connection. After the connection is established, what does the user see? If you're a user, you go to google.com, right? As I'm talking through kind of how this is all working, right? In your browser, what do you see after the initial connection is established? Right, you don't see anything, right? Because at this point, all you know is where Google's computer is. There's been no data exchange back and forth, right? So at this point, you need to actually tell the computer, hey, I want to see your homepage, or give me kind of the materials I need to see your homepage, right? You make a request from the Google server, and then Google will give you back, an HTML document with either JavaScript probably embedded into somewhere, right? Then they give that entire file back to your browser, and your browser essentially renders it for you, right? So in that entire exchange, at the end of the day, what you're really doing is you want to figure out where Google is, you want to go to it, and you want to be able to make requests from it, right? So in this case, when you go to the homepage, you're making a request to Google to say, hey, give me all the HTML and JavaScript that will help me see your homepage. And Google gives you that, right? And Google does give you that, right? If I go to google.com and the page loads, right, I then go offline, that page is still there, right? It doesn't disappear. And the reason why it doesn't is because Google literally gave me the raw HTML and the JavaScript that I need to render that page. And